these are the kind of practices, are they not, that have earned, if you will, Shia's, the deep criticism of some Sunni scholars who essentially, in some cases, actually consider Shiism to be an apostasy or a heresy of some kind. And it's, I believe this accusation is based in the kinds of practices that you've described, which are not necessarily against the strict reading of the Islamic law, but are nonetheless at least additional to it or separate from it, and in some views additional in a way that creates idolatry and other kinds of practices that mainstream or more traditional-minded Sunnis reject.
That's correct. I mean, the criticism of Sunnis of Shias is multi-layered. It begins with the very rejection of the first successor of the Prophet. It then extends to this belief that the Prophet had a charisma, and that charisma transferred to his descendants, and that those descendants somehow were above other Muslims by their knowledge of the intent of God or their spiritual caliber. All of these, many Sunnis believe, are not validated by anything the Prophet said or by scripture or by revelation, and that they also presume that some Muslims are above other Muslims, which runs against the whole egalitarian ethos of Islam. And then there are, over the centuries, there are differences in law. Because these two communities developed in different ways, the Shiites have different interpretation of law on issues of women, inheritance, commerce, etc. And Sunnis also believe that some of those legal practices are unacceptable innovations. And then the third layer is pointing to specific Shia practices that particularly very, if you would say, literally minded Sunnis find objectionable. Like that the Ashura has, that kind of a observance of anniversary of someone's death has no reflection in at least classical Sunni scripture, theory, theology, etc. So yes, the Shia practices, the Shia beliefs, the Shia law are all points of contention. The real issue is whether over the centuries some Sunni theologians adopted an attitude of tolerance and live and let live, and some kind of inter-Islamic ecumenical engagement, or whether they picked up on the track of damnation, exclusion, and persecution of the Shias.
Well, you quote in the book Ibn Taymiyyah, who is a 13th century Sunni scholar, whose name we have heard in these conversations before, as perhaps the first precursor of what we know today as Islamic fundamentalism of the Sunni stripe. And you quote him condemning Shia Islam as a heresy, essentially. So this school of thought carries deeply into the history of Sunni Islam. And up to the present day, there are senior Sunni authorities who have reaffirmed this view, even while there are some who have accepted Shia Islam as a legitimate practice, a legitimate expression of Islam.
Well, Ibn Taymiyyah historically represents that tradition of narrow literal reading of the text and exercise of judgment on beliefs and practices that are intolerant and also require action to eradicate them. Now, he was not necessarily influential or popular for many centuries, but he was discovered and resurrected and adopted by not only fundamentalists, but also more so even by the extremists that have followed the fundamentalists, the so-called Salafists and the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia. And they draw on the methodology of interpretation of Ibn Taymiyyah and on his rulings to essentially very clearly define in black and white terms what is Islamic and what is not. And also follow his reasoning to say, well, that which is not Islamic must not be tolerated and must be eradicated and fought. Sunnis have never accepted Shiism, if you would, de jure, legally as, say, a fifth school of Islamic law or as a legitimate form of Islamic law. Rather, at times of tolerance, for instance, for a long period of time in Egypt or in India, they accepted that to coexist with it. So in other words, within Sunni Islam, there are also other traditions other than Ibn Taymiyyah who are more tolerant. They're tolerant of diversity, they're tolerant of pluralism, they're tolerant of practices that might not be acceptable very clearly based on scripture, but they haven't gone out of their way to purge society of that which they don't like. And as a result, you've had periods of coexistence between these two communities through vast parts of history, but that does not mean that Shiites were accepted as part of the family. Even after the Iraq War, there was a lot of talk in the Middle East about tolerance. And there were many conferences that were held in Jordan, in Qatar, about Shia-Sunni unity. And they always came up like the United Nations with a declaration at the end that we're all one and we shall not fight. But a number of Shia clerics, including the Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, said that's all fine. But acceptance will come when you accept Shia law as a fifth school of law, which the Sunnis are not prepared to do. So as far as they go is to say, well, you're not one of the schools of law, we will merely tolerate your existence.